It is my great pleasure today to introduce Philip Forness, who is Associate Professor of Christianity at the University at the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at KU Leuven. Having studied classics and theology at the University of Valparaiso and Princeton, he obtained his PhD in History of Christianity from Princeton with a thesis focused on Jacob of Syriac. After his PhD, Philip was a postdoctoral researcher at the Universität Frankfurt, where he was first involved in the project Polyphony of Late Antique Christianity, and then became the PI of the project Cultural Exchange from Syria to Ethiopia. Currently, he is also the director of the Leuven Center for Eastern and Oriental Christianity. And since 2022, he is also the PI of the project Translation on the History of Eastern Christianity, and the co-PI together with Harmut Lepin of the project Commentary on the Ecclesiastical History of John of Ephesus. This project is currently working together with Syriac.org and the Patristic Text Archive in Berlin to produce a digital critical edition. And Philip is in fact involved in digital humanities as well, and he collaborated both with the Gregory Project and Syriac.org. Among his numerous publications, I would only mention his monograph. Philip published First and Second Maccabees for the Antioch Bible, and the volume Jacob of Syriac, the Homily on the Apostles, Thomas, and the Resurrection of our Lord for the CSO, and the volume Preaching Christology in the Roman Near East for OUP. Today, he will present a paper entitled The Role of the Bible in Shaping Historiographical Imagination, the Ecclesiastical History of Pseudo-Zachariah. Philip, the floor is all yours.
So much, Georgia, for that kind introduction, and for all of you for being here. I usually can't attend TeTra because I teach Thursday mornings until 11 o'clock, so it's really a delight to be here. I've been able to be here a few times in the last years and have come to really appreciate and embrace the concept, also of presenting unfinished projects and things that we want to focus on to discuss. So not simply results that we've already had, but things that we're thinking about and that we'd like to gain feedback on. So my presentation should be understood with that background. I'd like to share my presentation. And let's see how this works. Okay, I think everyone can see it now. Today I'm going to be talking about a 6th century Syriac historiography, which is the Ecclesiastical History of Pseudo-Zachariah. This is written around the year 568 or 569, or completed around this time, and to think about what role the Bible played in shaping historiographical imagination. This project comes from 2 different areas in my own research. One is the project that I'm a part of in Frankfurt and in Leuven, which is focused on, yes, as Georgia mentioned, producing a new critical edition, translation and commentary on the 3rd part of John of Ephesus's Ecclesiastical History. So work that was written actually just after Pseudo-Zachariah's Ecclesiastical History. Maybe the earlier parts of John of Ephesus's work were written at the same time as this one. And a second one, which was simply that I was invited to write an article for a collected volume that's being put together by Carson Bay, Jeremiah Coogan, and Peter van Nuffelen on the Bible in late antique historiography. So this is really a part of a larger project. I think when that volume is out, maybe there will be more precision, different terminology that could be used to describe what I found within this work. I'm also really happy that Jacob Lawler is here, who wrote the article on John of Ephesus for that volume. So something we've been thinking with and dialoguing also with him with our project on John of Ephesus in Frankfurt and in Leuven. What I found as I was writing and researching for this article on Pseudo-Zachariah was that there were some that one doesn't really know what one will get when one is assigned a topic to work on a specific historiography, and what role will the Bible play? Will we find anything that's interesting to keep talking about? And I found that with Pseudo-Zachariah, there were some things that seemed quite standard to me, and then something that seemed quite distinct. So today I'll be presenting that aspect of the project at the end of the presentation, something that I'd like to keep thinking about and keep discussing. And I invite you especially to offer critique of that, as well as comments that might help me think further about that. So let's get started with the Bible in 6th century Syriac historiography in general. to think about where we should be looking if we want to find the place that the Bible had in shaping the imagination surrounding history writing in the 6th century in Syriac. So I'll present two works that are not Pseudo-Zachariah before I move to Pseudo-Zachariah. First, we have John of Ephesus. This is the beginning, the manuscript image you see of it's a first folio. We're missing one folio of this manuscript. It's where the third part of John of Ephesus's Ecclesiastical History begins. What we find for this chapter and the following chapter is that John of Ephesus brings in a number of Bible passages that have apocalyptic imagery. So this seems to be one of the ways that he is trying to frame this entire work. Let me just read one example of these. John writes, this is beginning in the second line if you want to follow on the Syriac. That is, along all these schisms, quarrels, and divisions, along with these frequent bitter persecutions and the harsh imprisonment and bonds which we see, all of these are among the final birth pangs. For indeed our Savior also proclaimed and said in that passage, repent, the kingdom of heaven has drawn near to you. John of Ephesus returns to this apocalyptic imagery throughout the ecclesiastical history, but it's concentrated here at the beginning. So he provides this as something like a frame for interpreting the historiography that will follow. If we look at another Syriac historiography, the Chronicle, or rather, perhaps better, the history of Pseudo-Joshua the Stylite, written in the early 6th century, there's been an article that just written on this that I actually encountered for the first time this week by James Wolfe, where he looks at the use of Isaiah within Pseudo-Joshua. Wolfe argues that Isaiah is an intertext, alongside which the author, Pseudo-Joshua, wants his readers to interpret the story that he's telling. And like in John of Ephesus, we don't find these Bible passages in every chapter from Isaiah. Where we find them is at the beginning, right in the middle, chapter 47, and then at the end, one of the chapters in the 100, so as it's moving to a close. Wolfe writes that this punctuates his narrative with explicit citations of Isaiah. So we get the idea that the imagination, the biblical imagination that Pseudo-Joshua wants to inspire in his readers as they read his history alongside the Bible, only needs to be referenced at key moments within the text. I'm going to suggest something the same for Pseudo-Zachariah as we move throughout the work in the following. So let's look at this work of Pseudo-Zachariah. For those who are unfamiliar, let me just provide a brief introduction to it. Pseudo-Zachariah is, of course, not known by name. That's why he's Pseudo-Zachariah. He's probably, or it seems likely, a monk from Amida, modern-day Diyarbakir in Turkey. We know this because he talks a lot about Amida. He seems to have immediate access to information about this city, especially in the 7th and the 8th books of this work. And then he also refers to a library that was brought after a bishop died in exile back to Amida. So it's possible that Pseudo-Zachariah also had access to the same library. The scope of this work is enormous, but it's not a chronicle. It goes from creation until 568, 569. I'll explain what it looks like to start with creation because it's not quite the same as in other works. He has an anti-Chalcedonian perspective, so he is very much opposed to the Chalcedonian tendencies of the empire, the Roman Empire, and he specifically situates it within the genre of ecclesiastical history. So you see that also within Brooks' interpretation, or Brooks' translation there, and a different term was chosen for the English translation, but he at least himself refers to it as an ecclesiastical history and seems to frame it in this way. This is a complex work. Sometimes Pseudo-Zachariah has been called, rather than a historian, a compiler, because we have essentially different segments of this work have been drawn from different primary sources. He seems to be compiling these sources, sometimes translating them or having them translated, and then putting them together in some sort of loose historiographical work. The first two books are the most confusing in this regard, and actually these are the ones that have never been translated alongside the whole work. And that's because, while we start with the preface of the compiler, we end up with translations of a number of works within these books. We end up, for example, with the entire translation of Joseph and Asenath. So I think it's about 30 or 40 pages within the printed edition. About the 10th of this work is simply a translation of this other text that doesn't really follow a historiographic pattern. What seems to be happening in these books is that they're making up for what was left out in other accounts, at least in the view of the compiler. Books 3 to 6 are a translation and an abridgment of the Greek historiography of Zechariah Rhetor, a contemporary of Severus of Antioch, someone who was also on the anti-Chalcedonian side. This work is mostly lost to us. We have quotations in the Evagrius Scholasticus, other quotations of Michael the Syrian, and the compiler talks at the end of Book 6 about how he abridged this work, taking the long-windedness of the Greek and compiling it in a way that could be understandable to a Syriac audience or Syriac readership. The last 6 books come from diverse sources. As has been identified in the translation, there seems to be different sources for the reign of Anastasius, and then the reigns of Justin I and Justinian I. And there's different sources. There's some geographical materials in here. There's some chronological materials that end up in here, where he seems to be drawing on different sources and putting them together in some sort of a loose narrative. Because of this difficult structure of the work, I think it's best to talk about the role of the Bible in shaping historiographical imagination in terms of each of these 3 sections. So I'll begin with sections 3 to 6, then move on to books 7 to 12, and finally turn back to books 1 and 2, where I'd like to suggest something that I'm still working on, trying to think through, and that I'd love to get some feedback on. Let's start with books 3 to 6. In books 3 to 6, we have 2 uses of the Bible. We have, first, a number of documents that are simply inserted into this, so letter exchanges between different people or creeds that are put in there. I've kind of taken these out of the consideration here because these aren't from the compiler. They're simply in the sources that he's using, these documents that he's chosen to include. But to look at the historiographical materials within these books, we have a single use of the Bible, and that is to praise and to criticize ecclesiastical leaders. So one example of this comes at the beginning of Book 3. This book is starting around the year 449, and it's going through the lead up to the Council of Chalcedon. He's trying to explain why Pope Leo ended up supporting Chalcedon, and he suggests that Theodoret of Cyrus, another Diophysite, went to Pope Leo, bribed him, and then this made Pope Leo turn to the side of the Chalcedonians and compose his tome. So he writes about this nearly at the beginning of this book. With a bribe that blinds the eyes of the wise, as it is said, or rather the eyes of the soul of all who are carried away by it and by seductive words, Theodoret of Cyrus subjugated Pope Leo I, and anger against Dioscorus of Alexandria and against the rest of the true bishops filled Leo, whereupon he composed the letter that is known as the Tome. So we see that there's a biblical reference here, and it's used to talk about how the wise, Leo, can be blinded by someone else, in this case by Theodoret, and with a bribe. So we see that this is used to criticize Leo, but also to criticize Theodoret. Later in the same chapter of this book, we have Dioscorus, the Patriarch of Alexandria, who supported the non-Chalcedonian or anti-Chalcedonian side, who is said to have refused to go along with the Chalcedonians at the council. And he writes about him in this way. Dioscorus stood up from his chair and sat on the pavement, saying, I do not sit with the wicked, and I do not go with fools. So Dioscorus stayed true to this passage from the Psalms about not going along with the wicked and not going along with fools, and he refused to go along with Chalcedon. So we see here, this is a single way, aside from these documents that we find within books 3 to 6, that the Bible is used within these chapters. I think it's quite a minimal use of the Bible. There's much more expansive ways that one could use, so it's a bit surprising to only find this single use, even if it's somewhat predictable. And in fact, when we turn to the next section, the third section of the Ecclesiastical History of Pseudo-Zachariah, we find that books 7 to 12 also have the same use of it. So the praising and criticizing ecclesiastical leaders comes up in both of these sections, something that actually combines their use of the Bible with each other. But we also find different uses of the Bible as explanation of events, as a point of comparison for similar events, and for as a source for general geographical and historical knowledge. We'll see an example of 2, 3, and 4. I won't go over 1 since we've already seen an example. Okay, let's begin with the second use I've identified here of the explanation of events. I think it's easiest to just take an example to explain what I mean here. At the beginning of Book 7, the discussion is about the siege of Amida in 503. This was an event that loomed large in Syriac imagination. So we have homilies written on this, at least 2 homilies written related to this event that were incorporated and read in liturgical settings in Syriac. And we also have a number of historiographical sources that refer to this event, including Pseudo-Joshua, for example. The chronicler, Pseudo-Zachariah, wants to describe the actions of the bishop of Amida, John of Amida, during the time of this siege and portray him in a positive light. He does so as follows. John of Amida warned and admonished the wealthy of the city, saying that in a time of famine and with the coming of the Arabs and pestilence, they should not hoard grain in such a time of distress, but sell it and give it to the needy. Lest, in hoarding it, they store it for enemies, in accordance with the passage in Scripture, and so it happened. So here there's maybe some overlap with the praise and criticism of ecclesiastical leaders. John of Amida essentially had known maybe this biblical passage, and he chose to give this advice to the rich in the city that they shouldn't hoard their grain because this makes it easy for it to be stolen by their enemies. But the way it's presented in here, lest in hoarding it they store it for enemies, in accordance with the passage in Scripture, seems to be something of an explanation for this event. It's not directly related to the person who accomplished this, John of Amida, who gave the warning, but it simply is the conventional wisdom of the Bible, that when you do this, it will result in this. We have something of a general use of the Bible to explain events, how things happened. We have a different usage when the Bible is used, I think, more in terms of its literary imagination as a point of comparison for other events. An example of this is also related to the siege of Amida, just to make it simple, where we have Pseudo-Zachariah write as follows. The affliction and the severity of the famine that happened in this city, that's Amida, surpassed the one that arose during the capture of Samaria and the devastation of Jerusalem described in Scripture and recounted by Josephus. So here we have this narrative in the Bible about the capture of Samaria, serving simply as a reference point to emphasize how severe and how difficult the affliction was that the people of Amida suffered during the siege. This is also then interestingly compared to Jerusalem, as found in Josephus, probably Josephus's Jewish Wars, which the 6th book, we have a couple of examples within Syriac. So we have the Bible here used within the literary imagination simply to emphasize these biblical events and to say that it can be compared to them, but it actually goes beyond them. A 4th use of the Bible that we have within these books is as a general source for geography and history. So we have things that will be talking about a specific place, and we'll say, well, in this place, Solomon also built a temple. Or something along these lines. So there's geographical knowledge that the Bible has, and it's used in here to also present geographical knowledge. We have this also with historical information, where sacred history, or biblical history, if we might put it that way, is brought into line with other history. So you could almost think of something like a table of chronicles of kings who are set alongside each other. We just have this in written form here in the Ecclesiastical History. So, for example, in Book 10, Pseudo-Zachariah writes, "In the 3rd year of the siege of the city of Ilion, which was ruined in the days of Samson and Eli the priest, who was in Jerusalem, kings began to arise in the city of Rome, which had earlier been called Italy, and the kings who reigned in it were called kings of the Latins. In the days of Jotham and Ahaz, king of Judah, Romulus ruled in Rome." So we have a chronology being developed here, and the biblical narrative is brought into accord with some narratives about classical antiquity. This is one way in which the Bible is simply used as historical, to bring about historical knowledge. It is one source alongside other sources. So with this 3rd section of the ecclesiastical history, we have a diverse use of the Bible, which might reflect the diverse sources that were used to compile these books, but also points toward the general breadth of the imagination, the role of the Bible in shaping historiographical imagination within the 6th century. I'm going to move towards, I think, a less secure part of my presentation, and that's what I found very interesting about Pseudo-Zachariah's use of the Bible, where I think there's a correlation made between wisdom and history writing at the beginning of this work. To discuss this, I first need to explain the structure of the first book, which is quite different than in other historiographies. So first we have a preface by Pseudo-Zachariah, by the compiler, which discusses that the work will go down to 568 or 569. It describes the scope of the work, what will be included, references already some of the works to be mentioned. I think it's a preface that might have been written after the entire work was already complete. Then the next 2 sections, we don't know precisely who the author was. I'll say more about that later. But we have in book 1-2 a request for clarification on genealogy. So this is where we get actually back to the beginning of creation, goes through the genealogies in the Bible. And we have a response to this, a clarification that's provided by the addressee. So this is a letter sent as a request, and then a response is written in book 1, chapter 3 to this. In book 1, chapter 4, we have another request, this time for a translation of Joseph and Asenath, the story of Joseph and his wife in Egypt. We have a response to this request saying, yes, I will translate it for you. And then we have the whole translation in book 1-6. So this is the structure at the beginning of here. And where we find wisdom mentioned in a major theme is within book 1-1 through book 1-5. So all 5 of these chapters have a relationship between, or have a distinct emphasis on wisdom. Whether we can bring that into dialogue with history writing is the question that I'm exploring. So let me just sketch some of my current thoughts on this and where I'd like to continue to think with this source in this way. The preface by Pseudo-Zachariah begins with a reference to Genesis 6 and the flesh that is found in the Syriac version here. This is the narrative just before the flood comes, so it's the corruption of humanity. And then there's a long quote from the Book of Wisdom, which occupies about half the page in the printed edition. This huge quote from Wisdom, the Book of Wisdom, which talks about wickedness. There's then a tracing of wickedness throughout salvation history. So through Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel, through some other passages, going chronologically through the Old Testament, and then down to Methodius of Olympus, who mentioned apparently a statue to which people brought oil to venerate it, and he sees this also as a reflection of wickedness at this time. So we have the problem of wickedness within humanity. And then there's an abrupt transition to what we find on the right-hand side of the screen. Let me read this. How right and fitting it is for eager and discerning readers that following on from the 3 ecclesiastical histories of Eusebius, Socrates, and Theodoret, so he understands his work in the same way, succeeding events that took place at different times, that are scattered about and not collected together in a single volume, should be assembled and set down based on documents or letters or reliable oral sources. May the recording and writing of these things proceed with the assistance of Christ our God, We pray that he may give us the wisdom and eloquence to describe in an unconfusing way the truth of what has happened. So Pseudo-Zachariah begins here with a reference to the wickedness of humanity, and the antidote for this seems to be to bring some order out of this chaos. And that is what the process of history writing is. Now, to the theme of wisdom, 2 points of connection that I see. One, at the very end of the long quotation, we have a prayer for wisdom and eloquence. You'll see this return in some other sections. And then we have at the beginning this quotation from wisdom literature. So this huge quotation from Wisdom 1:16 to 2:9. When we look at the subsequent chapters, where we have these questions on genealogy, a response, a request for a translation, a response to a request, it's wisdom that dominates the biblical passages here. Many of these passages on the screen, I don't think anyone knows them immediately, but many of them mention wisdom specifically, or talk about the wise one who said this. Some of them seem to be interpreted in this fashion, so they provide something like conventional wisdom. But wisdom is the theme that recurs in all of these chapters. There's some overlap here in terms of citations from books like Wisdom that we also find within Pseudo-Zachariah. And I have a question, and I'm not sure on this. I think it needs to be examined probably much more on a linguistic level or a philological level, whether chapters 1 and 2, or 1, 2, and 1, 4 were also written by Pseudo-Zachariah. I think it's possible, but this needs to be, I think the style is quite similar to what we know from how the compiler wrote, but this needs to be investigated further. And whether the accumulation of all of these citations related to wisdom at the beginning of this book is meant to be read as a frame for the task of history writing. So this is the question that as I've been going through my research on Pseudo-Zachariah, that has occurred to me, and I'm not sure whether I should conclude in favor of or against this thesis or this hypothesis at the moment, but that's anyway the thoughts that I have at the moment, and I really look forward to your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much for illuminating paper. We are now opening the floor for conversation. Feel free to jump in any sort of way you want, waving at me. I think we're in 2 screens territory, but I probably won't miss anyone. I'll start, if I may. How does this, what you described about the use of the Bible, compare to other ecclesiastical history in Syriac of the same sort of time and area?
Well, so we have 4 from the 6th century aside from Chronicles. So Pseudo-Zachariah, John of Ephesus, Pseudo-Joshua, and then Barhat Bashaba Arbaya, which is more, biographies that are put one after one another. So quite a different genre. And I don't think there's nothing like a theme of wisdom that occurs in any of these. On the other hand, we have with John of Ephesus a very strong emphasis on apocalypticism, and I don't see any of this in Pseudo-Zachariah. So there might be different tendencies and ways that they were trying to frame the task of writing historiography, or how you should be interpreting these events that differ from one another quite drastically. And I think that's quite clear in comparing John of Ephesus to Pseudo-Zachariah, that they have different ways that they're engaging with the Bible.
Thank you very much. Andy, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Philip. I actually want to continue on this line of questioning, in the sense that because he mentions Eusebius, Theodoret, and Socrates in his introduction, is there a link there in terms of his emphasis on this wisdom literature, or is that a continuation of that tradition? Because I don't really remember how that works in his Greek predecessors, because that might be a link, but I don't know.
Yeah. remember it when I read them with them, but I also wasn't looking for it when I read them. So that's something I think I'm hoping that this collected volume, whenever it comes out, will see we can see if there's commonalities with this, whether wisdom is one. Where I do see I have reflected a bit on the idea of wisdom as a metaphor, or what can be gained through translation. And so you have this already with the request to translate Joseph and Asenath here, but you also have it in a number of Syriac sources in the 6th century. So it's certainly a way that the act of translation was framed as an act that was done in the pursuit of wisdom. So it could be that actually there's more of a parallel there than there is with historiographical writing in general. But this is, my current thoughts.
Maybe just another question if I may, regarding, again, also in connection to the issue of genre, of course, because it's interesting that actually he considers himself writing in sort of the continuation of the ecclesiastical historians, whereas I would say, looking from it from a modern perspective, it's conceived very differently from any other ecclesiastical history that we know. And even I seem to remember with it Greatrex and Horn and Phoenix suggest calling it a miscellaneous history, I think, or
Yes.
in contrast to maybe a chronicle or an ecclesiastical history. How would you sort of work that in there? Do you consider, I mean, you mentioned in your introduction, say, okay, well, I'm calling it an ecclesiastical history, but do you have any other thoughts on that, maybe in connection to its use of the Bible?
I think it's so maybe some ways that we could see it as an ecclesiastical history. It's a very complex work, of course, just with this different structure and lots of sources that maybe compiler is the better word than author for it. But I think there's really those can be understood, of course, as the same thing. He's an author of some sorts. Where we do have an overlap with ecclesiastical histories would be in the inclusion of documents related to church history. So we have this in book 2, where you have a number of the documents leading up to Chalcedon. And then you have documents inserted in books 3 to 6, probably taken over from Pseudo-Zachariah, from Zechariah Rhetor's work. And then 7 to 12, you have other ones. So you have some of the correspondence of Severus in shortened form that's brought into here. And the focus here seems to be on the ecclesiastical history, and not another form of history. In terms of the Bible, we have the praise and the condemnation of ecclesiastical leaders rather than rulers. So this does seem to be, in a way, the focus, but we just have a work that has diverse sources. So maybe a category like geographical history, where we have the Bible used to provide geographical information, doesn't go as well with ecclesiastical history, or sort of this chronology where we're harmonizing biblical rulers with other known rulers. This maybe is something that doesn't pass as well into an ecclesiastical history from maybe a strict definition, but in this work it does. So we have a bit of, miscellaneous history is not a bad term for it either. But he sees himself as carrying on the tradition of ecclesiastical history, and provides that for about 120 years. So we do have a sense in which it is a continuation from the synoptic historians, of the Greek synoptic historians.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. It's Georgia and then Albert, and then Alberta.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was really fascinating. I'm not sure if it plays a role in your analysis, and probably I'm going to use the wrong terminology, but I was wondering whether you notice any correlation between the function of biblical quotation and the kind of quotation. So, I mean, whether it's explicit or implicit. So if the author says, as the Bible says, this is what you should do, or the first example didn't say explicitly that the passage was taken from the Bible. So
Yeah,
that would also
notice,
tell us how much he expected his audience to immediately recognize
yeah. I
quotation.
did, as I went through this, I put a star next to all of the quotations that had a direct quotation, and then I left the sort of allusions without a star. So I'd have to look through to see if there's a correlation. Certainly within some of the theological treatises, you have explicit quotations, but also we saw a number of those already. Yeah, that's something I should definitely look into. But I don't have an answer at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks.
Albert?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was also struck by a quotation of Matthew 3:2. It is a quotation of John the Baptist, but Zachariah says that it is a quotation of our Savior. How do you think of it? Is it only a loose?
Okay. I think this was not in, was this in the presentation?
Yes, at the beginning.
Ah, yes. So this is yeah, this is John of Ephesus.
Yes.
Yeah,
But
that
he
is quite
says
striking.
Jesus says it.
Yeah.
What do you think of it?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Maybe it's more powerful if it's in the mouth of Jesus rather than in the mouth of John the Baptist. But
for a historian,
yeah. No, it's quite interesting. It's something to keep track of with the John of Ephesus project, whether there are other instances where there's misattribution. But yeah, you're right. It didn't occur to me when I just read it. It seemed to just flow. Yeah, of course Jesus would say something like this, but no, it's John the Baptist. So, yeah, quite. Thank you.
It's curious anyway. But thank you.
Thank you.
Alberto, then Sebastian, then Jacob. Alberto?
Thank you, Philip. I only would like to pose the question of the sources of Pseudo-Zachariah, also from this point of view, the use of the Bible. What struck me also in your answers before is that there's a tendency to eliminate apocalypticism, if I understood it correctly. This is interesting because Zacharias quotes a lot of text by Timothy Eilers, you know, and if there is an author that is apocalyptic, this one, and I think my idea is could be the following: that when he quotes Timothy, he avoid quoting the apocalyptic developments that are so frequent in it is like John the Baptist in the Gospels. You know that the apocalyptic dimension is in Matthew and Luke and not in Mark, for example. But this is only a question. Now, the other point is so the problem of how much is the influence as a general problem for all of us that are collaborating to the project of the Bible in historiography is how much of the sources that are using the historians are influencing their way of understanding the role of the Bible. Now, second point is the problem of apocalyptic for me is absolutely central for the understanding of Christian historiography in general, because I think that the relationship that you see between the historian and the political power is a great problem that can be also solved in apocalyptic terms, also when Apocalypse, Revelation is not quoted, but you know that there are a lot of other books. Now, the other problem is wisdom. This is very interesting. Our little text that is the Egyptian yes, the Egyptian history of Syriac of Alexandria. There is a certain insistence of the person who love wisdom, that should understand history. Twice or three times, and also in the Coptic history edited by TeTra, there is those who those who love wisdom, who are particularly involved in historiographic understanding. I would like to understand better this problem, because it is clearly a problem of the audience. The audience that could be not only the clerical audience, but also an audience that goes beyond the clerical circles. But it is only, it is a problem. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So I will try to respond. I wrote down 3 different areas to talk about. So the first, the avoidance of apocalyptic in Timothy. So this would be new for me. I didn't compare. So Timothy ended up in the section where, there are the hundreds of quotations then that you have in these sources, and it kind of went away. But I was just looking at, there's a lot of quotations of Bible and allusions to the Bible in the section from Timothy. Yes, so it would be quite interesting to compare some of these that might be known elsewhere, if they are, to see if there is indeed an avoidance of apocalyptic imagery. So I think it really stands out when you compare it with an author like John of Ephesus, especially, for whom this is very present. The second one is the sources. This is a really huge issue when you look at a historiography, also, especially like Pseudo-Zachariah, where we know that there's just a dizzying array of sources. And actually, his presentation of the Bible is, of course, related to these documents that I mentioned that weren't in my study, because it's all part of the same work. So how are we to how should we be dealing with this? Where I was interested was with this praise and the criticism of the leaders, that we can find this at least within the last 10 books, not in all of them. We don't have book 11 anyway, but we can find we can find similarities between them, between the way that they're using the Bible. And then we might have to puzzle out why there's differences there as well. For the love of wisdom, so this is great. I've written down these 2 references, both Egyptian references, to the love of wisdom in the writing of history. And I guess where I'm trying to think with this and to see if it's different, as I mentioned earlier, that I've seen this connection with translation literature and wisdom as a theme that comes up there in Syriac sources. I didn't find it in any of the Latin literature on wisdom at all. And you also find it to a certain extent when reading philosophy, of course. So we have this with Sergius of Rashina, so his introduction to Aristotle. Also talking about bringing the wisdom of the Greeks and then learning from this. And so it's whether this love of wisdom takes on a particular form within historiography, or if it's just love of wisdom from reading any books. And especially books you didn't know about. So that's what I'm really, I can't wait for the results of this volume, and to think through this with maybe a broader range of sources, looking beyond the Syriac tradition as well. So thank you for those references.
Thank you. It's Sebastian, Jacob, and then Silvio. Sebastian?
Yeah, thank you, Phil, very much for your question, for your interesting talk. My question kind of connects to Andy's earlier question, and people that know me might roll their eyes that I, of course, ask a question about Eusebius. I found it very interesting that, first off, that Pseudo-Zachariah mentions Eusebius, of course, but also his use of the Bible in connection to history. And how he uses that, which of course doesn't only connect to Eusebius's Chronicle, but also to his preparation of the Gospel, in which he of course uses these connections between biblical history and secular history, or however you want to call it. And in that work, it is, of course, used to make an argument of antiquity, of the Hebrew history, which in turn is Christian history. Do you find anything of that in Pseudo-Zachariah, or is that not an issue for him anymore to prove the antiquity of Christianity, and how he uses that those connections that he creates?
Yeah, thank you. That's really fascinating, and something I could also use some time to think more about. But just at the moment, perhaps two things to say is that he really does view himself as a continuator of these other authors. So he's assuming a familiarity, at least with the ecclesiastical histories of Eusebius, Socrates, and Theodoret. So to what extent he feels the need to rehash what they have. He does fill in things like Joseph and Asenath. So it seems, I don't know why he includes that work in this, to be honest, but it does fill in aspects that wouldn't be in Eusebius with the Josephus story. So maybe there's some motivation there. I'm not quite sure. But where we might find this, I think, is in that quotation from Book 10, where you start to see the parallels being made between sacred secular history, however we want to talk about as biblical, and extra biblical history. So maybe there's still a sense that it needs to come in. It's a strange place to put it in Book 10. So we're quite a ways away from the genealogy, which is discussed in chapters 2 and 3, which mostly has to do with differences in the Syriac and the Greeks and the corruption of the biblical text as it goes into Syriac. As it went to Greek and then went into Syriac. So there might be something there, that this is still, there's the idea that the world in which they live in, that the biblical text needs to be mapped onto it, or perhaps the reverse, that the world that they live in, that they're perceiving, is mapped onto the biblical world. And I think we get this with that fourth category of geography and history quite nicely within this work. Whether there's an emphasis on the antiquity there, I'm not quite sure about. I didn't notice it, but yeah, I should think through that in relation to Eusebius as well. So thank you for that. Write that down.
Thank you very much. Jacob is next, and then Silvio's comment, please.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. This is just a really fascinating project that you're engaged in here. I just have a couple of very quick questions. One is actually one out of complete ignorance about the manuscript tradition of this. Is there only one manuscript, or is it so much like with John of Ephesus, where we're just missing a lot of copies and whatnot, or is it maybe more widespread? And then my other question actually is to continue asking about this possible connections with John of Ephesus. And I'm particularly struck, maybe it's nothing, it's a small point, but I'm struck that these two figures appear to be from the same place. They both seem to come from Amida. They're both writing approximately around the same time as each other. I mean, are there connections between them? They both are maybe anti-Chalcedonian. They're maybe not in the same place as each other, but it's very fascinating to me that we have these two figures that presumably are from the same area as each other, and whether or not they're interacting, and the legacy of these histories that come from these particular figures at this time. So
Thank you. So the manuscript tradition is quite similar to John. So we have one main manuscript and then some quotations. Georgia is the one who could really tell you more about the preservation of them. So she could say more and be much more precise than I could be. But there are, I think the image that was circulated here was from one of those collections of the Vatican manuscript. But we don't have a wide transmission of these, as I think most late antique Syriac historiographies. As far as Amida, yeah, this is quite interesting. So John, I guess, comes probably from a village somewhere near Amida, probably is a monk there as well. perhaps a similar time to Pseudo-Zachariah, although we don't really know much about him. But they're both writing in the 560s. So the first two parts of John of Ephesus probably are written at the end of this. I guess is the current something we still need to explore in Frankfurt and Leuven a bit more on with our project on this. But I think that's the current opinion exactly at the moment when Pseudo-Zachariah is writing. Yeah, I mean, they had access to different libraries, I assume, at this point too, between Constantinople and maybe Amida, if that is where Pseudo-Zachariah actually wrote the work as well. And but maybe they both had access to the common library that was brought by the Bishop Mara of Amida. I think he acquired it when he was in Egypt, and then some Greek sources were brought back to Amida earlier in the 6th century. So they must have had access to a similar, well, I don't know, but they would have been in a place that had a similar library at some point and had a great wealth of information also from Greek sources. Where I think it's interesting to compare them is in the need to write a history at all. So when does it become evident that you need to write a history for the anti-Chalcedonian movement? That could be separate from other histories, or to write it in Syriac as well. And that does seem to be a really interesting similarity between these two authors that we have. That John had it, of course, with his cast of saints, with the lives of the Eastern saints that he wrote earlier. He wrote a few other works about specific events, Justinianic plague, and there's trying to remember, there's maybe someone else from the team in Frankfurt will remember it, but there's one other work he's supposed to have written, I think, with another sort of sad situation. Anyway, but there are these moments to write about specific events, but when do you need to weave a master narrative? And it seems that for both of them, this was the moment to do that, and with an anti-Chalcedonian perspective. So I think that's very interesting to think about the community, and when you could think that the community would want this sort of work, or might need this sort of work. Maybe a sense of separation from the empire. Not quite sure. John was quite close, but knew that maybe it wasn't going the direction he wanted it to. Difficult question, but thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe Silvio has an observation on Silvio, please.
Yes, exactly. So thank you very much for this fascinating talk, especially hearing about the parallels and the differences between Pseudo-Zachariah and John of Ephesus. And well, I really don't have a question, but I already wrote it down in the comments concerning that apparent misquotation of Matthew. So that there is just another passage where it's the same quotation, the same terms used, and there it's really Jesus who is speaking. So we can kind of defend John of Ephesus there, and he was not misquoting the Bible.
Thank you. And I should mention, Silvio probably has already written this in our commentary, and I've read it, but didn't incorporate it into my presentation. So thank you, Silvio, for the correction there. And yeah, it gives us also an insight into how John of Ephesus uses the Bible. And maybe why he chooses to say that Jesus said this rather than John the Baptist. You have both options, so you go for the one that is maybe more impactful.
Speaking of biblical quotations, in my work on things like that, there are a lot of biblical quotations. They're not always, as you would find them in a manuscript or in an edition. Did you, in the quotations that you found, that you looked at already in your text, did you find instances? Does the author keep strictly to the biblical text, or every now and again bends it to fit their argument here and there? Did you look at some differences that might appear in the biblical text that he's using?
Yes, so I think so you're often trying to decide whether something is a quote or not a quote. To make a decision if they leave out two words in the middle, is it still a quote? Depends maybe on the length of the quote. So there's a lot of this going on. And I think some of these criticisms and praises, you really have to stretch your imagination to see how they actually fit that context. So there's definitely a lot of that going on. They have something in their mind of these words together, but then it doesn't quite fit onto the context. So the exact context. So with the bribe, this would be one example of that. What's interesting is that there's within the beginning of book 1, in one of the requests, there is a reference to the differences between the Syriac and the Greek versions, related to a passage from Jeremiah. So there it's interesting that there's really a keen attention to the actual wording of the Bible, and not simply just a random reference, but very much attending to the exact words of the Bible, and why this might differ in Greek and Syriac. So we find some of both, some very loose and some very careful.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Andy?
Can I maybe just ask a question in relation to this, in terms of the translated parts in this work? Do you see that those biblical references, when they're really more quotations than allusions, does it follow the Peshitta, or still rather more the Greek text? Is it changed in function of what the Peshitta says, or does it just depend?
Yeah, actually, they are changed. Not always, but they are changed. This is something that I was very thankful that the I think if anyone's worked with this marvelous translation of this work in the translated text for historians, they have this copious notes, which is makes it fantastic. And one of the things they did attend to was whether it came from the Peshitta or not. And so in a number of them, also in the sections that would be coming from Zechariah Rhetor, so from a Greek work originally, some of these were modified, but not all the time. So there's, but they did make that effort some of the time, which means they were trying to produce to have their readership recognize the quotation the way that they would have been accustomed to hearing it.
Just maybe an additional question in relation to this, because it's a problem I'm working on now in a very different context, which is an Armenian translation of the Homily of Jacob. In terms of, do you find that in those cases where it's changed to the Peshitta, is it by coincidence maybe words from Jesus, or is it not that kind of is there not that kind of methodological framework? Is it a certain theme of quotations that are properly changed, or is it just random, well, more or less random?
Yeah, I have to admit I didn't pay attention to that, so I can't say it. But I think actually most of the quotations are not from Jesus in general. So I think there's not really much of a tendency to quote Jesus versus other parts of the Bible. Paying attention, I think Georgia had a similar question, and paying attention a bit more to the way that these quotations are introduced, that there's several more things that could be investigated here. This is definitely one of them. So thank you.
Thanks.
Wolfgang?
Thank you. First of all, excellent lecture. I haven't read Pseudo-Zachariah yet. Can you tell me a few of your observations about the style of Pseudo-Zachariah? If I remember correctly, the style of John of Ephesus shows us that he was not a trained writer.
Yeah. Yeah, how to explain John of Ephesus? It's a bit of a nightmare to read them sometimes. I think with both of the authors, you do have the sense that we're dealing with authors who are familiar with Greek, to whatever extent, and that they reflect some of the translation ease, to talk here, to use this sort of terminology. So I don't think Pseudo-Zachariah, the passages that I've read in Syriac were not as long-winded or as syntactically complicated as those in John of Ephesus, which I think sometimes just are, sometimes you see the scribe in the manuscript of John of Ephesus just insert some punctuation mark to kind of just stop, and then you move on, because otherwise you can't really make sense of, you just need to pause. Pseudo-Zachariah isn't quite like this, but you do have some Greek isms, and we should expect this with the work that's coming from Greek, where many of the sources are translated from Greek into Syriac. But you don't have it reads differently than other Syriac prose, where you have a great flowing style. So if we go to other Syriac prose written in Syriac in the 6th century, it reads quite differently, I think. but maybe not as idiosyncratic as John of Ephesus. That's at least my impression, let's say.
Thank you.
Unless I'm missing a hand, I would like to raise hand. I'd like to thank our speaker today for his excellent paper and conversation, and to everyone who took part in, attended, or joined in with questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your thoughts and for thinking with me on these issues. That gave me a lot of fruit for thought for future work. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, also for joining.